The night sky above the Negev desert was supposed to be silent, swallowed by the vast emptiness of sand and stone. But at 2:47 a.m., silence shattered. Sirens wailed across southern Israel, their piercing cries echoing through the darkness. Moments later, streaks of crimson light ripped across the heavens. Dozens, then hundreds of warheads, blazing like falling stars. Within seconds, the ground convulsed. The first wave of Iranian ballistic missiles slammed into the desert, detonating with a thunder that shook Tel Aviv nearly 100 kilometers away. A towering plume of fire lit the horizon, brighter than dawn itself. Windows shattered, alarms blared, and terrified civilians scrambled into underground shelters. But the true target lay hidden beneath the sands, Israel's most secretive military compound and subterranean fortress said to house advanced weapons labs and an elite command center. For decades, it had been considered impregnable. Concrete walls thicker than bunkers, layered defenses, and the ever-reliable Iron Dome protecting the skies. Yet this time was different. Iran's newest generation of hypersonic missiles tore through the defense grid like knives through paper. Iron Dome batteries fired desperately, streaking the skies with interceptors, but they fell short. One after another, the warheads slammed into their mark. The desert roared, the earth trembled, and deep beneath the Negev, the nerve center of the Israel Defense Forces began to collapse. The world had long whispered about it, a fortress buried deep in the Negev, the beating heart of Israel's military machine. Official maps showed nothing but desert, yet beneath the sands, layers of steel, concrete, and classified technology formed what was believed to be Israel's ultimate stronghold. Now that stronghold was in ruins. Satellite images released only hours after the strike showed a scar across the desert floor, massive craters where reinforced bunkers once stood. From above, it looked as though the earth itself had been torn open. From below, survivors described a nightmare. Corridors caving in, walls buckling, fire racing through oxygen-starved tunnels.
Inside the compound, chaos reigned. Soldiers scrambled in the smoke, alarms screeched, and the ground kept shaking as more warheads tore into the complex. Communications were cut off within minutes. Those who managed to escape spoke of comrades trapped behind collapsed gates, their shouts swallowed by dust and flame. Casualty reports began to trickle in. Then they surged. By dawn, Israeli media, usually restrained in wartime, could no longer hide the truth. More than 3,000 IDF soldiers and officers were dead, missing, or buried alive. It was the heaviest single loss in Israel's military history. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and with it, the confidence of a nation that had always believed its enemies could never breach its defenses. Tel Aviv had not slept. Sirens still echoed, streets were choked with fleeing civilians, and supermarkets had been stripped bare overnight. Families huddled in underground shelters, clutching their children as the city trembled under the aftershocks of war. By morning, the Prime Minister appeared on national television. His face was pale, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed the fury simmering beneath. Iran has crossed the red line, he declared. They have struck at the very heart of our nation, killing thousands of our sons and daughters. This is not an attack, it is an act of war, and Israel will respond with a force the world has never witnessed. His words rippled across the nation like a storm. Some cheered, demanding vengeance. Others sat in silence, the weight of fear pressing down harder than the promise of revenge. Outside, lines of tanks and armored vehicles began rolling toward staging areas in the south. Fighter jets screamed across the sky, their roars a grim promise of what was to come. In Washington, the Pentagon convened an emergency session. The U.S. president vowed to stand by Israel, ordering additional warships into the Mediterranean. Across Europe, leaders called for restraint, but their voices were drowned by the drums of war. Israel had been struck like never before, and in that moment, Vengeance was no longer a matter of if, but when. The question that haunted the world was simple: how far would Israel go?
The strike on the Negev did not remain a regional story. It detonated across the globe like a second shockwave. By the time the sun rose over Jerusalem, the world was already on edge. In Washington, generals filled the Pentagon's war room. A map of the Middle East glowed on the wall, covered in flashing markers. Carrier groups were redirected toward the Mediterranean. "This isn't a skirmish anymore," one senior official admitted. "This is the spark of something bigger." In Moscow, the Kremlin denounced Israel's threats of retaliation, warning that any escalation could destabilize the entire region. Yet intelligence leaks suggested Russia had quietly placed its air defense systems in Syria on high alert, preparing for a storm that might spill across borders. In Beijing, China called for calm, offering to mediate. But even there, analysts on state television spoke of an irreversible march toward regional war. Meanwhile, the streets of the Middle East erupted. In Beirut, Baghdad, and Karachi, thousands poured into the streets waving Iranian flags, chanting slogans of defiance and victory. To them, the destruction of Israel's secret base was a divine triumph. But in Amman, Riyadh, and Cairo, governments remained silent, torn between fear of Iran's growing power and fear of Israel's looming wrath. News outlets around the world flashed one chilling headline after another: "The Middle East on the brink," "Countdown to regional war," "The spark of World War III." For decades, war in the Middle East had always seemed containable, bloody but limited, fierce but regional. This time, it felt different. This time, the whole world was holding its breath. Night fell again over the Middle East, but the darkness carried no peace. Smoke still lingered over the Negev, drifting like a shroud across the desert. Tel Aviv's skyline glowed faintly under the haze of fear, its streets quieter than ever, its people bracing for the unknown. Across the border, in Tehran, the mood was starkly different. Fireworks lit the sky. Crowds poured into the streets, chanting victory slogans. To them, Iran had finally struck a decisive blow against its sworn enemy. Yet behind the celebrations, even Iranian officials knew the storm was only beginning. Intelligence reports suggested Israel was preparing something unprecedented: long-range strikes, cyber warfare, even whispers of nuclear readiness. Analysts warned that the next Israeli move could drag the entire region into a war with no boundaries. The world watched uneasily. In Europe, leaders spoke of diplomacy, but their voices trembled with uncertainty. In Washington, military convoys rumbled toward air bases. In Moscow and Beijing, alliances were tested in silence. Every capital felt the tension, as if the world itself stood on the edge of a blade. For the first time in decades, the phrase returned to headlines with a chilling weight: World War III. Whether it remained a shadow or became a reality now depended on choices made in smoke-filled war rooms behind closed doors by men and women who carried the fate of millions. And as midnight passed, one truth was undeniable: the war between Israel and Iran was no longer just theirs. It belonged to the world.